After decades of molecular tinkering that produced little more than patent extensions and marginal improvements, we finally have meaningful expansions in our therapeutic inventory. There are two updates with some impact on the clinical practice. Esketamine's FDA approval as monotherapy for treatment-resistant depression and Uzedy's expanded indication for bipolar I disorder maintenance. Both arrived in 2025 and both surprisingly represent substantive clinical advances rather than pharmaceutical theater. Spravato received its initial FDA approval in March 2019 as an adjunctive therapy, which is to say the FDA's way of hedging its bets by requiring a companion oral antidepressant. One can appreciate the regulatory caution even if it felt somewhat like requiring training wheels on a motorcycle. The drug worked through an entirely novel mechanism, NMDA receptor antagonism, yet we were instructed to pair it with the very SSRI and SNRI that had already failed for the patients, since Spravato is approved for treatment-resistant depression. Johnson & Johnson announced on January 21, 2025, that the FDA approved esketamine nasal spray as the first and only monotherapy for adults with treatment-resistant depression. The approval came after priority review, which in FDA parlance means they actually paid attention rather than letting the application gather dust for the usual interval. The monotherapy approval rests on study called NCT 045-99855, a multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 4 trial conducted from November 2020 to January 2024 at 51 outpatient centers in the United States. Now, what is more significant? Study design. The trial enrolled 378 participants meeting predefined MADRS severity criteria who received at least one dose of study drug. 197 received placebo, 86 received esketamine, 56 milligrams, and 95 received esketamine 84 milligrams, administered twice weekly for 4 weeks via nasal spray. The demographics tell a familiar story. Mean participant age was 45.4, 61% were female, and baseline mean MADRS total score was 37.3. These were genuinely treatment-resistant patients. 59% had failed 2 antidepressants and 40% had failed 3 or more. The median duration of their current depressive episodes was 192 weeks, nearly 4 years of suffering through what we euphemistically call therapeutic trials. At day 28, the primary endpoint, esketamine demonstrated statistically significant and clinically meaningful improvement with a 56 milligram dose, showing at least a square mean difference of 5 points versus placebo. The effect sizes were 0.48 and 0.63 respectively, modest by some standards, but in treatment-resistant depression, we take what we can get. But here is what should make you sit up. At day 2, approximately 24 hours post first dose, both esketamine doses showed significant improvement over placebo, 3.8 points for 56 milligrams and 3.4 points over 84 milligrams. 24 hours. When was the last time you saw that with an SSRI? By week 4, 22.5% of esketamine-treated patients achieved remission compared with 7.6% of placebo patients. The number needed to treat for remission ranged from 6 to 12 depending on dose. Not miraculous, but respectable. The most common treatment-emergent adverse events for combined esketamine doses were nausea, 24%, dissociation, 24%, dizziness, 21%, headache, 19%. The dissociation particularly merits discussion with patients, though one might argue that temporary dissociation surely beats interminable depression. Most adverse events occurred on dosing days, 85% for esketamine, with most resolving the same day in 89% of the cases. Notably, nausea and vomiting events were concentrated in the first 3 dosing sessions and attenuated thereafter. The body adapts, unlike regulatory bureaucracies. The REMS program remains in place, requiring administration in certified facilities with 2-hour post-dose observation. Yes, it's inconvenient. Yes, it adds cost, but one can hardly fault the FDA for caution with a Schedule III controlled substance that produces dissociative effects. What does this approval actually mean for practice? First, for patients who cannot tolerate oral antidepressants and given the sexual dysfunction, weight gain, and general malaise SSRIs often induce, we now have a legitimate monotherapy option. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it simplifies the treatment algorithm for the most desperate cases. When you've tried 2, 3, 4 oral agents and various augmentation strategies, you can now proceed directly to esketamine without the theatrical requirement of adding yet another SSRI to the mix. This is efficiency born of necessity. The irony, of course, is that it took until 2025 to recognize what clinical experience suggested years earlier. Esketamine works on its own. One can only imagine the number of patients who endured unnecessary oral antidepressants with their side effects just because regulatory approval lagged behind pharmacological reality. Now, the matter of payment, because in American healthcare, efficacy means little if insurers don't cover it. Medicare. Medicare Part B covers esketamine treatments when administered in REMS certified healthcare facilities, typically paying 80% of the cost after the deductible, with the remaining 20% as patient's responsibility unless supplemental insurance covers co-insurance amounts. Treatment sessions typically cost between $700 and $1,200 each, and during the initial treatment phase, patients may require twice-weekly sessions. The arithmetic is sobering but not insurmountable. New York Medicaid. New York State Medicaid covers esketamine under fee-for-service when specific medical necessity criteria are met, requiring practitioners to bill it as a by-report item with documentation and manufacturer invoice. In practice, doctors need to complete the Spravato clinical criteria worksheet for Medicaid to approve coverage. Bureaucracy, in other words, but traversable. Commercial insurance. Most major carriers, United Healthcare, Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, cover esketamine, though prior authorization remains the rule, rather the exception. Coverage depends on meeting clinical criteria and obtaining necessary prior authorization. The manufacturers offers a copay assistance program for commercially insured patients, though, as always, government insurance beneficiaries are excluded from such largesse. The practical reality, if your patient meets the criteria for treatment-resistant depression, that means 2 failed adequate trials of antidepressants, coverage is generally obtainable, though it requires the usual documentation gymnastics we've all come to know and loathe. Uzedy was first approved in the United States in May 2023 for the treatment of adults with schizophrenia. On October the 10th, 2025, the FDA approved Uzedy as once monthly extended-release injectable suspension as monotherapy or as adjunctive therapy to lithium or valproate for the maintenance treatment of bipolar I disorder in adults. The approval process reveals an interesting regulatory approach. The FDA-based approval on existing clinical data for Uzedy and model-informed drug development methodologies that leverage previous findings on the safety and efficacy of risperidone formulations already approved for bipolar I disorder, in addition to the efficacy and long-term safety and tolerability of Uzedy for schizophrenia. In plain English, rather than demanding entirely new trials, the FDA accepted that risperidone is risperidone regardless of delivery mechanism, a refreshingly pragmatic stance. Uzedy is the first subcutaneous long-acting formulation of risperidone that utilizes SteadyTech technology, a copolymer technology proprietary to MedinCell that controls the steady release of risperidone, allowing therapeutic blood concentrations to be reached within 6 to 24 hours of just a single dose. This represents a genuine advance over Risperdal Consta, which required intramuscular injection and did not achieve therapeutic levels for weeks, necessitating oral supplementation during initiation. With Uzedy, therapeutic blood concentrations are reached within 6 to 24 hours after a single dose, meaning you can discontinue oral risperidone essentially immediately. For the bipolar 1 disorder indication, Uzedy is now approved with 3 once-monthly dosing options, 50, 75, and 100 milligrams. The medication can be administered either monthly or every 2 months, though for bipolar maintenance, monthly dosing is the approved interval. The approved leveraged data from 2 phase 3 studies originally conducted for schizophrenia. The RISE study. RISE was a multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled phase 3 trial evaluating the efficacy of risperidone extended-release injectable suspension for subcutaneous use in patients aged 13 to 65 years with schizophrenia. 544 patients were randomized to receive Uzedy once monthly, once every 2 months, or placebo. The primary endpoint was time to relapse, a hard, clinical, meaningful outcome rather than rating scale manipulation. The SHINE study. SHINE evaluated the long-term safety, tolerability, and effect of Uzedy administered once monthly or every 2 months up to 56 weeks in 331 patients aged 13 to 65 years with schizophrenia. Nearly a year of safety data, more than we have for many drugs at launch. Clinical application in bipolar 1 disorder. Bipolar 1 disorder is defined by episodes of mania, periods of abnormally elevated or irritable mood with increased energy and activity, and often episodes of depression causing significant disruptions in thinking, behavior, and daily functioning. An estimated 1% of 3,400,000 plus U.S. adults will develop bipolar 1 disorder in their lifetime, and it is associated with poor long-term outcomes and a substantial increase in mortality compared to general population for both suicide and cardiovascular disease. The approval as maintenance treatment, either as monotherapy or adjunctive to lithium or valproate, addresses a critical clinical need, medication adherence. Treatment adherence to daily oral options frequently presents as a major impediment to effective care in bipolar 1 disorder. Indeed, anyone who's practiced psychiatry for more than a week know that bipolar patients, particularly when manic or recovering from mania, display a remarkable talent for forgetting their medication precisely when they need them most. Safety profile. The most common adverse events reported in clinical trials were headache, Parkinsonism, dizziness, movement disorder, fatigue, constipation, indigestion, sedation, weight increase, pain in extremity, and dry mouth. In other words, the usual litany of antipsychotic side effects. Risperidone doesn't become less troublesome simply because we've improved the delivery system. The subcutaneous administration does offer one advantage. It is the only long-acting subcutaneous formulation of risperidone available in both 1 and 2 month dosing intervals. For those troubled by intramuscular injections, and this includes a non-trivial number of patients, the subcutaneous route is genuinely preferable. Insurance coverage. Medicare, long-acting injectables and antipsychotics are typically covered under Medicare Part B as they are administered by healthcare providers. Coverage is generally more straightforward than with esketamine, given the decades of experience with risperidone and other long-acting injectables in bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. New York Medicaid. As of January 20, 2026, Uzedy is listed on the New York Medical Pharmacy Program preferred drug list under non-preferred drugs for second-generation antipsychotics. Non-preferred status means prior authorization is required, but authorization is routinely granted for appropriate indications. The bureaucratic hurdle is low. Commercial insurance. Teva offers a patient-saving programs for commercially insured patients, potentially reducing out-of-pocket expenses to as little as $0, though maximum program assistance per prescription and annual benefit limits apply. Patients enrolled in any state or federally funded healthcare program, including Medicaid, Medicare, VA, or TRICARE, are not eligible for this assistance. The standard pharmaceutical industry practice of subsidizing those who least need subsidies. For self-pay patients, the average retail price of Uzedy is approximately $2,107 per injection. Sobering, but not wildly out of line with other long-acting injectables. Esketamine monotherapy in practice. Patient selection. The ideal candidate has failed at least 2 adequate antidepressants trials, cannot tolerate oral antidepressants due to side effects, or requires rapid symptom relief. The 24-hour onset makes it particularly valuable for patients with significant suicidal ideation. Though one must remember it's approved for treatment-resistant depression, not acute suicidal crisis management. Treatment protocol. The induction phase requires twice-a-week dosing for 4 weeks, 8 sessions in total. Maintenance typically involves weekly or every other week dosing, though this can be individualized. Plan for 2-3 hours per session. Administration takes minutes, but REMS mandate observation requires 2 hours post-dose. Setting expectations. Patients need to understand they will experience some dissociation and likely some nausea, particularly in early sessions. Frame it honestly. You will feel strange for a bit, but we'll monitor you closely and it passes. Mystification helps no one. Patient selection. Best suited for patients with established bipolar I disorder requiring maintenance treatment, particularly those with adherence challenges. The monthly injection appeal to patients who want to set it and forget it rather than managing daily pills. Transition strategies. For patients already on oral risperidone, the transition is straightforward. Discontinue oral medication at the time of the first injection. For patients new to risperidone, consider oral tolerability assessment first, though this isn't an absolute requirement. Monotherapy versus adjunctive. The approval allow either approach. For patients stable on lithium or valproate who need additional mood stabilization, Uzedy can be added. For those who cannot tolerate or refuse mood stabilizers, it can serve as monotherapy, though the evidence base for monotherapy is thinner. These approvals, modest though they may seem, represent actual progress in a field where progress has been disappointingly sparse. We have not cured depression or bipolar disorder. Let's not pretend otherwise. But we have expanded the toolbox in meaningful ways. Esketamine monotherapy acknowledges that should have been obvious from the start. If a drug works, it works regardless of whether you pair it with agents that have already failed. The regulatory insistence on adjunctive therapy represents bureaucratic overcaution masquerading as prudence. Uzedy's bipolar recognizes that non-adherence isn't a character flaw requiring psychotherapy. It's a predictable human behavior requiring pharmacological accommodation. Monthly injections won't solve all adherence issues, but they'll solve many of them. Both developments share a common thread. They make treatment simpler and more practical. This is no small achievement in healthcare system that seems designed to make simple things complicated. Will these developments revolutionize psychiatric care? No. Will they help significant numbers of patients who have suffered too long with inadequate treatment? Yes. And that's sufficient reason for their existence. For those of you who have watched patients cycle through antidepressants after antidepressant, or who have seen bipolar patients destabilize because they stop their pills during a manic episode, those tools offer genuine clinical utility. Use them wisely, manage expectations realistically, and document thoroughly. Because while the medications are approved, the insurance company will still require proof that you've earned the privilege of prescribing them. One final thought: the approval processes for both medications demonstrate a welcome regulatory pragmatism. The FDA accepted that esketamine works alone and that risperidone delivered subcutaneously monthly is sufficiently similar to risperidone delivered orally daily that we need not repeat decades of research. This represents intellectual honesty in regulatory services, a quality we might wish to see more often. Questions are welcome, though I promise not to have all the answers, which, after all, distinguishes honest physicians from charlatans.